She was just a small orphan girl living alone by the river. But what she did for a limping stranger that night would bring 30 armed warriors to her doorstep at dawn and change both their worlds forever. The child's cries echoed across the rushing water as darkness crept over the wilderness. Clementine Shaw, barely 8 years old, dropped the firewood she'd been gathering and rushed toward the sound. Through the twilight mist, she saw her, a girl about her own age struggling in the shallow rapids, one leg clearly injured as she fought against the current. Most frontier children would have run back to their families, but Clementine had no family to run to. The tiny cabin behind her held only the memory of her grandmother, who'd passed 3 months ago, leaving her completely alone in this isolated stretch of river country. Perhaps that's why she didn't hesitate. Perhaps that's why loneliness made her brave. The native girl's dark hair was plastered to her face as she gasped and reached desperately for the far bank. Her leg, twisted at an unnatural angle, couldn't support her weight against the stones. Each time she tried to stand, the current knocked her down again. Fear and pain filled her eyes as she spotted Clementine on the opposite shore. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the divide. Two children, different worlds, one drowning while the other watched. Clementine had heard the stories whispered in town about native raids, about children taken in the night, about the dangers that lurked beyond the settlement borders. Her grandmother had warned her to stay away from their kind, but all she saw was a hurt child who needed help. Without another thought, Clementine waded into the cold water. The current immediately grabbed at her worn dress, threatening to sweep her downstream, but she pressed forward. The riverbed was slippery with moss-covered rocks, and twice she nearly lost her footing as she worked her way across the treacherous channel. When she reached the struggling girl, Clementine could see the extent of her injuries up close. The girl's leg was badly swollen, probably broken, and fresh cuts marked her arms where she'd been dragging herself through the brush. Her breathing came in sharp, painful gasps, and her skin felt cold and clammy to the touch. The girl spoke in her native tongue, urgent, frightened words that Clementine couldn't understand. But she didn't need to understand the language to recognize gratitude when she saw it. Working together, they managed to get the injured child to the safer, shallower water near Clementine's side of the river. Getting her up the muddy bank proved even harder. The girl, who managed to whisper Ayana when Clementine pointed to herself and said her own name, couldn't put any weight on her damaged leg. Clementine, small as she was, had to half carry, half drag her new companion up the steep slope to the cabin. By the time they reached the rough wooden door, both girls were exhausted and soaked through. Clementine's grandmother had left behind basic medical supplies, and she did her best to clean Ayana's wounds and fashion a splint from wooden kindling and torn fabric. The native girl endured the treatment with remarkable stoicism, only wincing when Clementine had to reset what was clearly a broken bone. As the night deepened around the small cabin, Clementine shared her meager supper of cornbread and wild berries. They sat by the flickering firelight, two orphans from different worlds, communicating through gestures and the universal language of kindness. Ayana's fever had broken, and some color was returning to her cheeks. But what Clementine didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, as she settled her unexpected guest onto the cabin's only bed, was that Ayana hadn't simply gotten lost. She was the daughter of Chief Running Bear, leader of the most powerful tribe in the territory, and 30 of his finest warriors had been searching for her since she'd disappeared 2 days ago, following her trail that led directly to this lonely cabin by the river. As Clementine drifted off to sleep on the hard wooden floor, wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, she had no idea that the sound of approaching hoofbeats was already growing closer in the distance. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin's single window, but it wasn't the sunrise that woke Clementine. It was the sound of horses, many horses, surrounding her home like thunder rolling across the earth. She sat up quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs as the reality crashed over her. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, she could see them, painted warriors on horseback, their faces stern and unforgiving in the pale morning light. Feathers danced in their hair, and weapons glinted at their sides. They had formed a perfect circle around the tiny cabin, blocking every possible escape route. 30 of them, just as the stories had warned. Ayana stirred on the bed, her fever-bright eyes focusing on the sounds outside. When she heard the familiar rhythm of her people's horses, her face transformed with relief and joy. She tried to sit up, calling out in her native tongue, words that sounded like celebration to Clementine's ears. though she couldn't understand their meaning. But the warriors outside didn't respond with the same joy. Their voices rose in harsh commands, and Clementine heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied. Through the window, she could see the lead warrior, a man whose presence commanded respect even from this distance, dismounting from his horse with deadly purpose. Terror flooded through Clementine's small body. Everything she'd ever heard about what happened to children who crossed paths with war parties came rushing back to her. The stories of burned homesteads, of families that simply vanished, of children taken and never seen again. She had saved Ayana's life, but now it seemed she had sealed her own fate in the process. Ayana must have seen the fear in Clementine's face, because she reached out with surprising strength, grasping the younger girl's hand. She spoke urgently, pointing to herself and then to the door, her meaning clear even without shared language. She would explain. She would tell them what Clementine had done. But would they listen? Or had Clementine's act of kindness already been interpreted as something far more sinister? The footsteps outside grew closer, deliberate and measured. Multiple sets of boots approached the door, and Clementine could hear the low murmur of voices discussing something in their native language. The tone was serious, almost grim, and she caught what sounded like anger in their words. Ayana struggled to her feet despite her injured leg, leaning heavily against the wall as she prepared to face her people. She looked back at Clementine with eyes that seemed much older than her 9 years, and in that moment, both girls understood that everything would change when that door opened. The knock came like a thunderclap, 3 sharp raps that seemed to shake the entire cabin. But it wasn't the violent battering Clementine had expected. It was controlled, almost respectful, as if they were requesting permission rather than demanding entry. Still, Clementine's hand trembled as she reached for the wooden latch, knowing that her next decision would determine whether she lived to see another sunset in this wilderness she'd called home. The door swung open to reveal the most imposing man Clementine had ever seen. Chief Running Bear stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders blocking out the morning light behind him. War paint streaked his weathered face in patterns that spoke of both ceremony and battle, and his dark eyes held the kind of authority that comes from leading warriors through life and death. But those fierce eyes immediately softened when they fell upon Ayana. The chief spoke a single word, what sounded like a name spoken with infinite relief, and Ayana responded with a flood of words in their native tongue. Her voice was urgent but respectful as she gestured toward Clementine, pointing to her bandaged leg, to the makeshift splint, to the empty bowl that had held their shared meal. Clementine stood frozen in the doorway, barely reaching the chief's chest, as more warriors gathered behind him. Their faces remained unreadable, but she could feel their eyes taking in every detail. The medicine supplies scattered on the table, the blood-stained cloth from Ayana's wounds, the careful way the native girl favored her injured leg. As Ayana continued speaking, something remarkable began to happen. The tension that had filled the air like smoke started to dissipate. The chief's expression changed from stern authority to something that looked almost like wonder. His gaze shifted between his daughter and the small white child who had clearly spent the night caring for her. Other warriors leaned forward to hear Ayana's account, and Clementine caught her own name repeated several times. Each time Ayana said, "Clementine," she would gesture with obvious gratitude, touching her heart and then extending her hand toward her rescuer. But the moment that changed everything came when Ayana struggled to demonstrate what had happened at the river. Despite her pain, she mimicked falling into the water, showed how Clementine had waded in to help her, acted out the careful journey to the cabin. When she reached the part about the medical care, she lifted her splinted leg and spoke with such emotion that tears gathered in her eyes. Chief Running Bear listened to every word, his weathered face growing more thoughtful with each detail. When his daughter finished her account, he turned his full attention to Clementine. For a long moment, he simply studied her, this tiny orphan girl who had risked her own safety for a stranger. Then he did something that shocked everyone present, including his own warriors. The great chief knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to Clementine's eye level. In halting but clear English, he spoke his first words to her. "You save my heart." He placed his hand over his chest, then gestured toward Ayana. "My daughter, my heart, you save." The warriors behind him exchanged glances of amazement. Their chief, a man who had never bowed to white settlers, who had fought to protect their lands from encroachment, was kneeling before a child. But what he said next would change not just Clementine's life, but the relationship between two worlds that had been at war for generations. Chief Running Bear reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew something that made his warriors gasp audibly. It was a medallion unlike anything Clementine had ever seen, carved from what looked like sacred stone and strung on a cord of braided horsehair. The intricate symbols etched into its surface seemed to tell an ancient story of protection and honor. "This," the chief said slowly, holding the medallion between them, "belong my father, his father before, many generations." His English was careful but determined, each word chosen with the weight of ceremony. "Only give to family, to blood." Ayana's eyes widened in shock. She spoke rapidly to her father in their language, her voice filled with what sounded like protest or disbelief, but the chief raised his hand for silence, his decision clearly made. "You have no family," he continued, looking directly into Clementine's eyes. "We have no daughter like you, but heart knows truth, spirit knows kindness." He paused, searching for the right words. "You are sister to Ayana now, daughter to Running Bear." The medallion felt warm in Clementine's small hands as he placed it around her neck. The moment it settled against her chest, she felt something shift in the air around them. The warriors who had seemed so threatening just moments before now looked at her with expressions of respect and acceptance. But the chief wasn't finished with his surprises. "Alone is dangerous," he said, gesturing toward the isolated cabin. "Winter comes soon. No family to help, no protection." He stood to his full height again, his decision clearly made. "You come with us. Learn our ways. Ayana, learn your ways. Both daughters now." Clementine's mind reeled. Everything she had ever known, this cabin, her grandmother's memory, the familiar bend in the river, was being offered up for something completely unknown. The fear of abandoning her past warred with the terror of facing another winter alone, surviving on whatever scraps she could gather or trap. Ayana struggled to her feet and took Clementine's hand, speaking softly in a mixture of English words and her native tongue. "Come, sister," she managed to say. Safe, warm, family. The word family hit Clementine like a physical blow. She hadn't truly belonged to anyone since her grandmother's death. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for months suddenly felt unbearable in the face of this unexpected offer of connection. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, doubt crept in. What would the other tribal members think of a white child in their midst? Would she be accepted, or would she remain forever an outsider looking in? And what about the world she would be leaving behind? Would she ever see another white face, ever return to the life she had known? Chief Running Bear seemed to sense her hesitation. "No, choose now," he said gently. "Time to think." But he looked around the empty cabin, taking in its isolation and the signs of a child struggling to survive alone. Winter not wait for decisions. As if summoned by his words, a cold wind suddenly swept through the open door, carrying with it the scent of snow from the distant mountains. Clementine shivered, remembering how hard the previous winter had been even with her grandmother's help. The chief stepped back, giving her space to process his offer, but his next word sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wind. "Other dangers come soon. Soldiers look for Ayana's trail. Find tracks to cabin. Better not be here when they come." The chief's warning about soldiers sent ice through Clementine's veins. She had heard stories about the cavalry patrols that swept through the territory, treating any contact between settlers and natives as potential conspiracy. If they found evidence that she had harbored Ayana, they wouldn't ask questions first. How long?" Clementine managed to whisper. One of the warriors stepped forward and spoke urgently to his chief in their native tongue. Running Bear's expression darkened as he listened. Then he turned back to Clementine with new urgency in his voice. "Sun high today," he said, pointing toward the sky. "Maybe sooner." The reality crashed over her like the river current that had nearly claimed Ayana. Stay here and face interrogation, or worse, from soldiers who would see her kindness as treachery. Or leave everything behind and venture into a world completely unknown to her. Ayana squeezed her hand tighter, sensing her inner turmoil. Despite her pain, the native girl managed to stand and limp toward the small collection of items that represented Clementine's entire life. Her grandmother's quilt, a wooden doll carved by hands long dead, a few precious books, and the tin box containing her grandmother's wedding ring. With careful movements, Ayana began gathering these treasures, speaking softly to her father. The chief nodded and gestured to two of his warriors, who immediately moved to help pack Clementine's belongings with surprising gentleness. "You bring grandmother's spirit," the chief said, watching as they wrapped the quilt carefully. "Honor ancestors. We understand this." But even as relief flooded through her at his understanding, a new fear seized Clementine's heart. What if I can't learn your ways? What if I don't belong? For the first time since arriving, Chief Running Bear smiled, an expression that transformed his entire face from stern authority to warm father. "Ayanna could not walk river alone," he said simply. "You teach her strength. She teach you belonging. Both learn together." The sound of distant hoofbeats suddenly echoed across the valley, still far away, but approaching fast. The warriors immediately stiffened, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The chief's smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Soldiers," he said grimly, "time to choose is now." Clementine looked around the cabin one last time, at the rough wooden table where her grandmother had taught her to read, at the fireplace where they had shared countless quiet evenings, at the window that framed the river where her new life had begun just hours ago. Then she looked at Ayanna, who was watching her with eyes full of hope and friendship, a Chief Running Bear who had offered her something she thought she'd lost forever: family. At the warriors who had already accepted her as one of their own. The hoofbeats were getting closer. Clementine reached up and touched the sacred medallion resting against her chest, feeling its weight and warmth. Then she made the decision that would reshape two worlds. "I'm ready." The moment Clementine spoke those words, the warriors moved with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, her few possessions were secured on horseback, and a gentle mare was brought forward, calm and steady, chosen specifically for a child who had never ridden. Chief Running Bear lifted Clementine onto the horse's back as if she weighed nothing, then carefully helped Ayanna up behind her. "Hold tight to sister," he instructed. "She keep you safe on horse. You keep her safe in heart." As they prepared to leave, Clementine took one final look at the cabin that had been her world. The morning sun painted its weathered walls gold, and for a moment, she could almost see her grandmother standing in the doorway, nodding with approval at the choice her granddaughter had made. The war party moved out silently, following deer trails that wound through dense forest and across hidden streams. The warriors had positioned themselves protectively around the two girls, with scouts ranging ahead and behind to watch for pursuit. Every few minutes, Chief Running Bear would ride close enough to check on them, his eyes constantly scanning for danger. But it was Ayanna who proved to be Clementine's anchor during those first terrifying hours. Despite her injured leg, she remained steady behind Clementine, offering quiet words of encouragement whenever the younger girl seemed overwhelmed. She pointed out landmarks: a eagle's nest high in an ancient pine, a waterfall that sang through the rocks, a meadow where wild horses often grazed. "My people," Ayanna said softly, using the English words carefully, "travel these paths many seasons. Safe paths, protected paths." The deeper they rode into the wilderness, the more Clementine understood that she was entering a world that existed parallel to everything she had known. This wasn't empty frontier land as the settlers believed. It was home to people who knew every stream, every game trail, every place where medicinal herbs grew. As the sun reached its peak, they crested a ridge that took Clementine's breath away. Spread below them was a valley she had never imagined existed, a hidden paradise where a clear river meandered through grasslands dotted with teepees. Smoke rose peacefully from cooking fires, and she could see people moving about their daily tasks. Children played near the water's edge while women worked on elaborate beadwork, and men tended to horses that moved like poetry across the landscape. "Home," Ayanna whispered, and Clementine could hear the joy and relief in her voice. But as they began their descent into the valley, Clementine noticed that people were stopping their activities to stare. Word of their approach had clearly preceded them, and curiosity about the white child was evident on every face they passed. Some expressions showed welcoming interest, others displayed obvious concern or suspicion. A few elder women spoke rapidly among themselves, gesturing toward Clementine with what looked like serious debate. Chief Running Bear rode ahead to speak with a group of tribal leaders who had gathered near the largest teepee. Their conversation was brief but intense, with several pointed glances in Clementine's direction. She couldn't understand their words, but she could read the tension in their body language. Finally, the chief returned and helped both girls down from their horse. The entire tribe had gathered in a large circle around them, creating an arena of curious and expectant faces. My people must hear the story, Running Bear explained to Clementine. Must understand why white child wears sacred medallion. Must decide if village accepts new daughter. Clementine's heart hammered as she realized that her fate, and perhaps Ayana's as well, hung in the balance of this moment. The circle of faces seemed to stretch endlessly around Clementine as Chief Running Bear began speaking to his people. His voice carried the weight of ceremony as he recounted the events of the past day, how his daughter had been lost, how a small white child had risked her own safety to save a stranger, how that act of pure kindness had bridged two worlds that had known only conflict. Ayana stepped forward despite her injured leg, her young voice clear and strong as she added her own testimony. She spoke with passion about Clementine's courage at the river, about the gentle care she had received through the night, about finding friendship where she had expected fear. An elderly woman near the front of the circle, her hair silver with age and her face marked by the wisdom of many seasons, raised her hand to speak. Her words were measured and thoughtful, and Clementine could sense that this woman held significant influence among the people. The debate that followed was respectful but thorough. Some voices expressed concern about bringing a white child into their community during such dangerous times. Others spoke of ancient traditions about hospitality and the sacred duty to protect those who showed kindness to their own. But it was a small voice that ultimately swayed the decision. A boy no older than 6 pushed through the crowd and walked directly to Clementine. He looked up at her with bright, curious eyes and said something in his native tongue that made the entire circle fall silent. Chief Running Bear translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says, "She has the same sad eyes as me when my mother went to the spirits. Sad children should not be alone." The elderly woman stepped forward and studied Clementine for a long moment. Then she reached out and gently touched the sacred medallion resting against the child's chest. When she spoke again, her tone had changed completely. Warm, accepting, final. Chief Running Bear smiled as he translated her words. "Grandmother Singing Bird says the spirit sent you to save Ayana because they knew we needed to save you too. She says a child brave enough to save a stranger is a child worthy of our protection." The circle erupted in voices of agreement and welcome. Women came forward with gifts of clothing and food, while children gathered around with shy but friendly curiosity. Men nodded their respect for the young girl who had shown such courage. As the sun began to set over the hidden valley, Clementine found herself sitting by a warm fire. Ayana beside her, surrounded by the sounds of a family larger than she had ever imagined possible. The sacred medallion caught the firelight, and she understood now that it represented more than honor. It was a promise of belonging. The lonely cabin by the river felt like a memory from another lifetime. Here, in this place where two worlds had learned to meet in friendship, both girls had found something more precious than safety. They had found home, and as the stars appeared overhead, Clementine whispered a prayer of gratitude to her grandmother's spirit, knowing that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest act of kindness. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where courage and kindness create impossible bonds in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe, and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.